Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who demands the keys to my garage. It all started last fall when life felt pretty routine. My job was stable, my family relationships were decent, and I was starting to get involved in some community events in my small suburban town. For most of my adult life, I'd lived quietly in the same house, left to me by my late uncle. The place wasn't huge, but it was comfortable. I particularly liked that it came with a detached garage that could fit 2 cars and had plenty of space for my various home improvement tools. The only weird aspect of my setup was my neighbor across the street, a man named Carter. He'd moved in 2 years ago, and from the get-go, I picked up on some odd vibes from him. Little did I know that what started as odd vibes would escalate into something beyond my worst nightmares. Carter was the kind of person who always seemed to be in the middle of something bigger than himself. He talked a lot about connections he had in different industries, especially real estate. He once bragged to me that he knew a guy who could get him deals on almost any property if the price was right. I usually took all that talk with a grain of salt. After all, lots of folks exaggerate to sound more interesting. But Carter was different. His tone had an oddly serious edge, as though everything he said was an undisputed fact. Most of the time, I just tried to steer clear of him. My job was demanding, and when I came home, all I wanted was a quiet life. One Friday evening, while I was unloading groceries from my truck, Carter ambled over. I expected the usual small talk. How's the weather? How's work? But he surprised me by going straight to a request. He said, I noticed you have plenty of extra space in your garage. I need to park a few cars I'm fixing up for resale, and your place is perfect for that. I must have looked confused because he continued in an almost scolding tone. Don't act like you're using the entire garage. I've seen it. Half of it is just empty. That rubbed me the wrong way. I mean, sure, I didn't always fill the garage to capacity. Still, I certainly didn't appreciate someone else telling me what I was or wasn't allowed to do with my own property. I tried to be polite. I explained that the garage was indeed mostly for storage. I kept my power tools, some camping gear, and an old motorcycle in there. I told him I wasn't comfortable letting someone else park their cars on my property, especially vehicles slated for resale. If anything went wrong, an insurance problem, a break-in, or anything else, I wanted no liability. Carter brushed off my concerns like they were irrelevant. He insisted it was no big deal, even promised me a percentage of some future profit, though he never specified the amount. I didn't bite. I just repeated that I wasn't interested. He looked taken aback but forced a half-hearted grin and left. At the time, I figured that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. Over the next few days, Carter popped up more than usual. If I went to check my mailbox, he was there. If I took out the trash, he'd be in his yard, waving me over, dropping hints about how parking his cars in my garage would benefit us both. He liked to mention how he had powerful friends who could make life easier for me if I cooperated. Something about the way he said it felt vaguely threatening, but I tried not to overthink. Still, a discomfort was brewing in my gut. My sister Erica visited one weekend for a barbecue. I told her about Carter's strange behavior, and she gave me a look that said everything I needed to know. Be careful. Erica had a nose for spotting trouble, and she kept telling me I should politely decline any further requests and keep my distance. She even suggested I install security cameras around my property just to play it safe, but I thought that was too extreme at the time. About a week later, I noticed odd footprints near the side entrance to my garage. Nothing was missing, but it was clear someone had been snooping around. It was the first real jolt of fear I felt. Was Carter actually trying to break in to see how much space I really had? I decided to invest in a few motion sensor cameras and installed them discreetly. I also told Erica, who agreed I was doing the right thing. Even though I'd always considered my neighborhood fairly safe, I wanted to be prepared. One evening, I was unwinding in my living room when I heard a loud pounding on my front door. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I raced over, peeked through the window, and saw Carter standing there, visibly angry. He demanded I open the door. Against my better judgment, I did, but I kept the chain on. He said, "We need to talk." I told him if he had something to say, he could say it where he was. Then, in a tone that was half menacing, half exasperated, he insisted I hand over the keys to my garage immediately. He claimed he'd done all this work. He had cars ready to be parked there. Cars that were apparently integral to his big resale scheme. I told him no, not happening. Carter turned red in the face, spat out something about me being uncooperative, and stomped away. At this point, it became more than a strange neighborly dispute. I felt violated, as though my own property was under siege by this pushy neighbor. I tried to reason out why Carter was so obsessive about my garage. If he was truly a flipper of cars or had a friend in real estate, maybe he thought my space was an easy fix for storage. Perhaps he didn't want to pay fees for a proper storage lot. All I knew was that I wanted no part in his scheme. Over the next month, the tension seemed to die down. Carter didn't show up at my door again, and I didn't notice any more strange footprints. I thought maybe he'd lost interest or found somewhere else to store his cars. I even took down the new cameras because I was worried they might draw attention from other folks in the neighborhood who'd wonder what was going on. That turned out to be a mistake, because not long after, the situation escalated in a way I never would have imagined. One rainy morning, just as I was about to leave for work, I saw an envelope tucked under my front doormat. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a typed notice stating that I was being evicted from my own house. That didn't even make sense. I owned my house outright. The letter claimed that Carter, through some legal maneuvering, had acquired the rights to the land on which my property stood. It demanded that I vacate within 30 days. I stood there in disbelief, the rain soaking through my jacket, reading and rereading this notice. It was laughably fake, but the official-looking letterhead made me uneasy. I went to City Hall during my lunch break to clarify the situation. An employee at the records office looked at the letter, squinted, and said, "I've never seen anything like this. It's definitely not from the city. This letter is bogus." They checked the registry, confirmed that I was the lawful homeowner, and told me I had nothing to worry about. I felt relieved but also unsettled, because who on earth would go to the trouble to forge an eviction notice? That evening, Carter showed up at my door again, wearing a smug grin. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. He told me that I was now in a delicate position and that he had big connections in the real estate game. He said if I didn't sell him the house for 50% of its market value, I would soon lose it altogether. I told him I knew the notice was forged. He just shrugged as if forging official documents was no big deal. Then he started rambling on about how he had a friend who worked at the local assessor's office, and together, they could red tape me into oblivion. I tried to keep my composure, but inside, I was fuming. How dare he threaten me with nonsense like that? Before he left, he dropped one final bombshell, telling me if I didn't agree by the end of the month, he'd turn my life upside down. Then he walked away, leaving me stunned on my own doorstep. I immediately called my sister to tell her what happened. She advised me to document everything and report him to the authorities if things escalated any further. I felt like the situation had already escalated. He was threatening to basically steal my home. But I also knew that if I went to the police with just a forged letter and idle threats, they might not take it as seriously as I hoped. So I stayed calm, documented what I had, and waited. The next day I tried to mind my own business, but Carter was out on the sidewalk talking loudly on his phone. I caught snippets of his conversation. He's not going along with it. And, "We'll just make sure he knows who runs this block." It made me cringe. Despite all this tension, I resolved not to confront him. Instead, I started reaching out to a few friends in the local community to see if anyone else had experienced issues with Carter. That's when I discovered a different neighbor, Tony, who had a scuffle with Carter about 6 months prior. Carter had apparently tried to bully Tony into selling an old trailer at a ridiculously low price. Again mentioning these connections, Tony told me Carter seemed to thrive on intimidation and had actually forced 2 other residents to move out by driving them to financial desperation. It was hearsay, but enough to make me realize this was part of a pattern. I'm generally a peace-loving guy, but the more I learned, the more I wanted to see Carter face real consequences for what he was doing. Tony gave me the idea to look into small claims court or talk to a real estate attorney to file some form of harassment case. At the same time, Erica insisted that I install better security measures and keep a written log of every incident. So I did. I put up new cameras inside and outside. I started saving every letter, every bizarre notice that found its way into my mailbox or under my doormat. And I even recorded audio notes on my phone whenever Carter confronted me. I also told my close friend Linda, who worked as a paralegal, about the situation. She said she'd ask around at her firm. It was a small family law firm, but one of the attorneys there had some background in property disputes. A few days later, Linda got back to me, saying her colleague thought Carter's actions could constitute extortion or attempted fraud if I could prove he was forging documents and threatening me financially. That was all I needed to hear. I decided to file a formal police report. When I went to the local police station, I was directed to a detective named Weston. He seemed patient and took the matter more seriously than I anticipated. I showed him the forged eviction notice, the logs of Carter's threats, and the suspicious behavior. Weston recommended a protective order if Carter's aggression escalated, but for the moment, we agreed to keep the conversation open and gather more evidence. He emphasized that forging legal documents was a major offense, and if I found any proof linking Carter to the forgery, that could strengthen my case. While I was collecting my evidence, Carter continued on his path of intimidation. He started telling people in the neighborhood that I was about to lose my house due to back taxes. A complete lie. One neighbor, a senior lady named Mrs. Penny, approached me at the grocery store, worried that I was having money troubles. She said Carter had mentioned I might have to leave town soon. I assured Mrs. Penny everything was fine and that Carter was spreading rumors. Then came the final straw. One evening, as I was returning from a work meeting, I found my front door vandalized with a large sign that read, "This house is sold. Previous occupant must vacate." It was attached with tape and there was some cheap chain around the doorknob. Furious, I removed it, went straight inside and checked my security camera footage. Sure enough, there was Carter, strolling up to my house around 2 in the morning, placing the sign and fiddling with the chain. I had him on camera in full color. That video was the turning point. I called Detective Weston and showed him the footage. He told me this was enough to at least charge Carter with trespassing and vandalism, and potentially more once they looked into the forged documents. I felt a wave of relief. After all this time, it seemed I finally had something concrete. Over the next few days, Carter was served with a notice to appear for questioning. I didn't see him around much after that, which was a huge relief for me and my peace of mind. I thought maybe Carter would just take a plea deal or some form of minor penalty, but something else happened that blew this entire thing wide open. It turned out this wasn't the first time Carter had tried such a scheme. During the course of the investigation, the authorities discovered a trail of suspicious real estate deals orchestrated by Carter in another city. In each case, he had targeted a homeowner, forged documents, and threatened them into selling property at a fraction of its value. Several people had lost large sums of money. Some lost their homes. The police connected the dots, and Carter was arrested on a slew of charges, including fraud, forgery, and extortion. Even after his arrest, the story kept unfolding. More victims came forward, some who recognized Carter from an old neighborhood. They revealed he'd used aliases and even faked a business presence online. In every instance, his strategy was the same: befriend or intimidate, attempt to gain control over someone's property, and then flip it for profit. Over time, he'd gotten bolder, targeting multiple neighbors at once, forging more complex documents, and even paying off a couple of unscrupulous people to help him create phony notary stamps. This had all caught up with him now. During Carter's trial, I was called as a witness, along with Tony and 2 others. The evidence I provided, especially the videos, the forged eviction letter, and the property vandalism, was instrumental in confirming Carter's pattern of criminal behavior. I remember the day I testified, I felt a mixture of nerves and determination. Carter had been so smug for so long, and part of me worried that he might still have some card up his sleeve. But the prosecution was thorough, and there was no escaping the volume of evidence stacked against him. In court, Carter tried to paint me as a liar, someone out to ruin his legitimate business. He claimed the eviction letter was a joke, and that the sign on my door was just a harmless prank. Nobody bought it. The judge didn't seem amused by that defense. Ultimately, Carter was found guilty. The sentence he received was 9 years, which I found out later was a result of multiple felony convictions and the fact that he was a repeat offender. After the trial, I found myself in a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved. The nightmare was over, my house was safe, and I wasn't going to be terrorized by Carter's demands anymore. On the other hand, I felt a deep sadness for the people who had lost so much before me. Some had to rebuild their entire lives because of Carter's manipulations. Although the law did what it could, those people still had the burden of picking up the pieces. A few weeks after everything wrapped up, my sister Erica visited to celebrate. We had a small cookout in my backyard, inviting a handful of neighbors and friends who'd supported me through the ordeal. Tony was there, happy that justice had been served, though still a bit bitter that Carter had nearly forced him into selling his trailer under duress. We talked about the importance of community and how we all should look out for each other. If we'd known sooner about Carter's behavior, maybe we could have banded together earlier. Surprisingly, in the weeks that followed Carter's incarceration, my neighborhood seemed more unified than ever. Mrs. Penny mentioned she felt safer now that such a manipulative individual was out of the picture. New families moved into homes that had been on the market for a while, and the entire area felt like it was turning a new page. Whenever I'd walk my dog in the evening, people would wave and smile. It felt different, lighter. In an effort to share what I'd learned, I started posting general advice on community bulletin boards, not name-dropping Carter or any specific details, but warning people to be cautious if someone attempts to coerce them into signing documents or giving away property rights. I advised everyone to consult an attorney if they encountered anything suspicious. The last thing I wanted was for someone else to get blindsided by a scheme similar to what Carter had tried to pull. I also took the time to update my home security system thoroughly. Even though Carter was behind bars, that sense of vulnerability I felt when someone tried to take advantage of me never fully went away. I added better motion-detecting lights around the garage, replaced the lock on the side door, and made sure every window had secure latches. It gave me peace of mind, plus it helped maintain the value of my property. On the more personal side, my job situation improved in an unexpected way. My boss learned about the ordeal, after I had to request some time off for legal proceedings, and decided I demonstrated a certain level of resilience and problem-solving. That led to a conversation about leadership, and a couple of months later, I was promoted to a managerial position. It's odd how life sometimes throws you a lifeline in the midst of chaos. Another subplot that intertwined during all this was the issue with an old friend, Jonah, who unexpectedly contacted me a few days after Carter's arrest. Jonah had heard rumors that I was dealing with some property dispute, and he wanted to see if I was okay. I explained the whole bizarre situation, and Jonah shared that he'd once worked with a shady real estate investor in a neighboring city who sounded suspiciously like Carter. Jonah told me some wild stories about how that investor scammed people by forging liens on properties. It was chilling to think how easily Carter might have done the same. Jonah and I reconnected, and we became closer than we'd been in years, finding common ground in our run-ins with unscrupulous people. Throughout this entire process, Erica was my rock. She kept reminding me that I needed to stand my ground because my property was my most valuable physical asset. She also made sure I approached everything legally, so Carter's illusions of having big connections wouldn't scare me into making rash decisions. It turned out Carter's so-called connections were mostly fabricated, or at best were small-time accomplices who had no real power. After Carter's conviction, a few of his alleged partners vanished from the scene. It became clear that most were only in it for the quick buck, and when faced with legal consequences, they abandoned ship. As for Carter's sentence, I heard rumors that he tried to appeal, claiming he was entrapped and that the judge was biased. None of that went anywhere, given the mountain of evidence and testimonies. I sometimes wonder how someone goes down that path. Did Carter start off just trying to hustle for a living and then spiral into full-blown criminality? Or was he always that manipulative? It's a question that crosses my mind, but one I'll probably never get a clear answer to. In the aftermath, I really learned the importance of trusting my gut. When Carter first approached me about using my garage, my instincts told me something was off. If I'd tried to be nice or cave to his pressure, who knows how deep I might have gotten into his shady dealings. Standing firm wasn't easy. I'm naturally a bit conflict-averse, but this experience taught me that sometimes you have to draw a line in the sand. Another piece of insight I gained was the value of documentation. If there's one bit of advice I could give anyone dealing with intimidation or potential fraud, it's to document everything. Save emails, texts, written notes, and install cameras if you can. In my case, that video evidence and the forged eviction notice were the linchpins that led to Carter's conviction. Without tangible proof, it might have boiled down to my word against his, and he was convincing enough to fool people who didn't know better. There was also a silver lining in terms of community support. Since Carter had manipulated more than one person, we came together as a neighborhood to share stories, help each other, and be on the lookout for suspicious activity. I realized that, in a sense, Carter inadvertently made our community stronger. People who barely knew each other before started talking more openly. I've even had neighbors volunteer to watch my house when I'm out of town. In turn, I help them with small tasks like picking up mail or moving trash bins when they're away. We formed a little neighborhood group that meets once a month in the park just to keep everyone informed. One of the more uplifting moments came from a neighbor named Marla, who was scammed out of $3,000 by Carter under the false pretense of some auto repair deal. She'd given him the money, hoping to purchase a car from him that never materialized. After his arrest, she was approached by a local consumer protection agency that helped her file a claim. She eventually got some restitution from the fund set aside by the court. When she told me that she finally got a small portion of her money back, I saw how relieved she was. It didn't erase the emotional stress she went through, but it was something. It reminded me that sometimes the system does help, even if it takes a while. Naturally, I also dealt with some bureaucratic headaches. I had to confirm multiple times with the city that my property records were intact, that there were no liens or claims. The forged eviction notice had no real legal standing, but I wanted to make sure no shady paperwork existed anywhere else. I also changed the locks on both my front door and the garage, just in case Carter had tried something with a locksmith or made duplicates of my keys. That level of caution has stuck with me to this day. I don't want to live in paranoia, but I do believe in being vigilant. From a financial perspective, this ordeal didn't cost me too much aside from replacing locks, installing cameras, and a few attorney consultations. Mentally, though, it was draining. I had nightmares about losing the house, about being kicked out on the street, about Carter's ominous threat that he could red tape me into oblivion. For a few weeks, I was actually worried that maybe he did have some real connections, but with time and clarity, I realized it was mostly hot air. In the end, this saga was a crash course in standing up for my rights. It reinforced the idea that private property isn't just a material possession, it's also a place of personal refuge. Letting someone else infringe upon it, even with innocent requests like storing cars, opens a door to bigger problems. If I had one regret, it's that I should have acted sooner. As soon as Carter started leaving those footprints around my garage, or the minute he began pressuring me about his connections, I could have notified the authorities. That said, everything worked out in the end, and maybe the timing was just right to expose the larger web of Carter's crimes. Shortly after his conviction, I was contacted by a local journalist who was investigating corruption and fraud in real estate. While I didn't want to become a public figure, I did speak off the record about my experience, hoping it would raise awareness. The journalist thanked me and mentioned there were many more stories like mine that never got resolved. It made me appreciate how fortunate I was to have caught Carter on camera and to have the supportive community and legal guidance. Many people aren't so lucky. Months later, life returned to a pleasant normal. My garage remained my own, securely locked, with no suspicious footprints or door knocks in the night. I got back to my hobbies, an old woodworking project and that vintage motorcycle I'd been restoring. Each evening as I tidied up my garage, I couldn't help but smile a bit at the memory of Carter's initial demand, "Hand over the keys to your garage." The nerve of that guy. Now I have absolute confirmation that nobody can just walk in and dictate how I should use my space, or worse, threaten to take my home. Every so often I drive past the county jail on my way to the highway, and I think about how Carter must be feeling now that he's behind bars. 9 years is a long time, especially for someone who likely counted on deception and freedom of movement to run his cons. Maybe he'll change, maybe he won't, but at least for a while, the neighborhood doesn't have to worry about him knocking on doors or forging documents to cheat people out of their property. I'll never forget that sense of helplessness when I first read that forged eviction notice. Yet, I'll also never forget the satisfaction I felt when Carter was finally brought to justice. It's not often that you see bullies and scammers face actual consequences, but in this case it happened. And I'm grateful for everyone who played a part in it. My sister Erica, Tony, Detective Weston, Linda the paralegal, and all the other neighbors who shared their stories and evidence. If there's a moral to this roller coaster ride, it's that knowledge and solidarity can overpower intimidation. And it's crucial to know your rights and stand up for them, no matter how insurmountable the opposition might seem at first. Today, when people ask me about any bizarre stories from my life, I can confidently say, "Let me tell you about my neighbor who tried to take my garage keys and then tried to evict me from my own home." It's such an outlandish start that folks often chuckle, thinking I'm exaggerating. Then I tell them the details, and their jaws drop. It's definitely not a story I ever thought I'd have to tell, but life surprises us sometimes. Fortunately, I can look back on this and feel relieved. My home is still mine, my peace is restored, and Carter is sitting in jail for a good stretch of time. I'm left a little more cautious, a little more certain about my legal boundaries, but also with renewed faith that if you keep a cool head, do your homework, and get the right people involved, justice can be served, even when someone claims they have all the power. Friends, thank you. See you soon.